It's also a material that's been through its own transformation, but it's also a material that you could be arrested for pouring down the drain. It's actually a hazardous waste material. And this has been made now 9 times around the world, and in most locations I've had to seek special licenses to actually acquire it.
Wow.
Because it's all listed as hazardous. In actual fact, this is very, very safe. It's not flammable. And I remember, it was a bit of a dare, but I'd rehearsed it. I remember when I first made it in 1987 in the Mats Gallery, and Space Studios rented out the Mats space to him. And they got wind of the fact that there was a room full of waste oil, and they came round like the police, wanting to close it down. And the reason was it was a fire hazard. So I struck a match and threw it in. Knowing full well that you cannot ignite oil unless you get it to its flash point. You can't ignite anything until you get it to its flash point.
Whoa.
Petrol has a very, very low flash point and doesn't need any heating. But this needs to go up to 70 degrees before it will ignite. You need to throw a burning tyre in there, and a couple of minutes later, it will ignite it. So, and I'd learnt this from the fire brigade, actually. Many years ago, I remember talking to a fireman who said in small fires indoors, sometimes they throw paraffin on the fire to put it out. And I said, surely it would catch light. He said, no, you've got to heat paraffin. And I said, well, why do you use it? He said, because water can be quite vicious. When you throw it onto a fire, it'll tend to throw and spit. So in certain circumstances, they'll use paraffin. So it made me think very much about, whether it was dangerous. And when you know these things, it's the hidden agenda. If you know these things, you can get away with a lot more. And that's why, in one sense, I think people are kind of amazed by it, because it's like, how can you put oil into a room that's not got a fire exit? Because it's not flammable. It's not dangerous until you start to interfere with it in some way. But, it's quite an extraordinary experience. For those who don't know anything about it, of course, the waste oil is in a tank up to your waist height.
Yes.
And you've got a steel corridor that runs into it that tapers. Not only does it taper, but the floor is slightly raised as you walk in. So it's the opposite of walking out to sea. You actually start to push your way up into the room, and you become this isolated thing or object amongst this extraordinary experience, and you find yourself unsettled at the very end, peering out to this upside-down world.
I guess some people almost freak out, don't they, when they...
There's been many cases of people having to be led out having suffered from vertigo. And what it does, it's actually a very interesting thing. It actually highlights that peculiar moment where the eye and the brain actually fall out of sequence. And the best way of describing that would be like if you're at traffic lights in your car or sitting in a train ready to go out of the station and the carriages next to you start to go off. You think you're on your journey. And then you see through that carriage and you can see the platform stationary. So you're not actually moving. Or the other one is if you're at traffic lights, you're looking at the lights and the car next to you starts to edge forward. You think you're rolling back, so you quickly put your handbrake on. It's that slightly unnerving situation where you can't comprehend what's actually going on.
Absolutely. And what about the kind of way in which we think of oil nowadays, more and more, I suppose, as this sort of omnipresent material that is capable of making so many people so wealthy, and yet is also capable of, I don't know, what shall we say, posing some kind of threat to the planet, even.
Well, the other thing is...
It's full of reverberations, isn't it, oil?
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite ironic that we've been talking about gold, and now we're talking about something that people create wars over. A material that is regarded as a hazardous waste material once it's had its use, but oil itself has a position like gold does. It's a precious material. However, we're told 20 years left, but this will endure. And these are all, as you can see, I mean, in 1987 when this was created, it's in a tank that follows the topology of the room. By that I mean the tank will go into the window and around through the, around the door, etc. It follows the very edge of the room it sits in, and was therefore described as like Wilson's most site-specific work to date. In actual fact, it's not site-specific. It can go anywhere I choose to place it, having been given the invitation. And as you can see here, this is the Saatchi Gallery again in 2001 to 2003, when he occupied County Hall on the south of the river in London.
Yes, very near the London Eye.
Yeah, and it's a much smaller room than Boundary Road, and it's a wood-panelled room, so it's performing in a very similar way. You know, the context, the focus is slightly different, but the ingredients are the same. You know, so each time the focus is manipulated and changed, and in each situation, you know, I find something to tweak to make it very different. And in this situation, you can see the door is open into that other room, which teases you to the end of the corridor where you want to look round. And as you look round, you can look down into the window and to the sky, and you get that rather unnerving situation. There's another funny story with this one. There is a clock on the wall. And the clocks, when I investigated the room before we installed, the clock was off on the mantelpiece. And when I came back before we put the oil in, there was a guy screwing the clock back on the wall, and I said to him, could he set the time to 10 to 9? He said, these clocks don't work, mate. They don't work. I said, no, could you just put it to 10 to 9? I said, so we had this kind of strange argument, you know. But for me, the time is 2050, you see. It's sort of 10 to 9, 8:50, so 20:50 on the clock. It's little things like that, you know, you can install the work, but it's finding little moments just to kind of fine-tune, and I think that's important in all the pieces of work.
What about this notion of pushing the onlooker, pushing the spectator, pushing the participant almost is the word, isn't it, to his or her limits? Because it occurs in a very different way up here, doesn't it, right now in Bexhill? But it's very much part of the oil piece. And I mean, how far are you prepared to go, Richard, in that respect? And why does it interest you so much?
I think in several of the works which are featured today, there is a sense of positioning the onlooker and making them perform, really, to the work. And I'm not sure why that is, but there is this necessity, I suppose, with me, if working with found objects, they either perform or the audience performs. You know, I don't want anything just static, or I tend to not work with anything just static. So in this instance, you know, if one's sort of dealing with an interior space and taking over the interior space, I still wanted a sense of threat from what this material was. And by that, the way of doing that was to put the onlooker at the very centre of the piece. And the only way you can do that, understandably, is to sort of dam it, to bridge it, to restrain it. And it's rather like, you know, the parting of the seas.
Oh, yeah,
You know, you open up this swathe into the work.
Yeah.
And what you're looking at is this extraordinary illusion, and it makes you more present of yourself. You're more aware of yourself.
In fact, you used the word onlooker just now. That doesn't really cover what you expect the people looking at your work to do, does it? You want them to do much more than onlook, don't you? You want them to be part of, almost.
Well, they are certainly part of this, and especially in certain of the installations where the notion of the queuing is out of the way, and that people can go in and they will see people at the end of the corridor, and they want to anticipate that experience as well. But at the same time, they'll see people reflected. What I quite like, which I haven't really spoken about before, is, and I noticed it in this one, that it's rather like the Lost Atlantis. You know, by looking down in the oil, you tend to see things you can't see in the real world. Now, that's difficult to explain, but like the piece at Boundary Road, if you look down, the reflection would bounce up and take you onto, like, a part of an I-beam that you couldn't look at because a light might be in the way. So this sort of sense of refraction exposes more of your real world.
Oh, yeah.
So there was that little tease to get people to look into the oil.
The image we're now looking at is in its present manifestation, isn't it?
This is
the new Saatchi Gallery in Chelsea.
Yeah.
Last time I went there, Richard, I discovered, to my dismay, that I couldn't actually walk into this passageway anymore.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
So what's going on?
Well, as you know, the piece is owned. It's owned by Charles Saatchi. Before installing this, I had a long chat with him where he did say to me, it might be possible that I cannot allow people into the corridor. And I said, well, we'll see about that. So I went ahead and built it, and for about 3 weeks you could go in and walk to the end and experience it as
What do you mean here?
Here.
Yeah.
And what you do is you, just off screen here to your right, you'll see a staircase that comes down off a viewing balcony with a glass balustrade round it. So you come in, you can look down. Then you'll go down the stairs and into the corridor. And after 3 weeks, I came back because someone had phoned me and said they weren't allowed in. And there was a rope cordon that said you couldn't go in. So I went and saw Charles about it, and he said, Richard, you've got to understand, I'm free to the public, and I have 5 coachloads of kids every day, and it can't be managed. They're getting oil everywhere. So it was his call. My retort to that was, you can change a child's life by putting them down the end of the corridor. You know, something might happen that changes their perception on their world for the rest of their lives. But, you know, he didn't buy it. What he did say, he conceded, said, if anyone phones me and books to go down there, they can. So if you phone the gallery and say, I'm phoning to ask permission to go to the end of the corridor, you'll be given a time.
Oh, I see.
And you can do it. And
Yeah.
I know people have done that. But if you cold call at the gallery, you won't be able to go down there. They won't allow it. So, unfortunately, you know, the piece has now been in the world since 1987.
Yeah.
And already there's a metamorphosis taking place in terms of its interpretation due to use. You know, and this is happening with a lot of artists. I mean, there's artists that are working with materials that are no longer allowed indoors. There's situations where health and safety is beginning to dictate just how the aesthetics work in this country and in Europe and around the world, you know.